So, hey, good morning. Thanks for coming. Today's class is on reversing valves and demand defrost. So sort of a heat pump centered class. This is part 3 in the Wade's Words of Wisdom series, reversing valve and demand defrost. As we've done in the previous classes, there will be some prizes today. At any time, if you have any questions, go ahead and just type those in the chat function. And the way to get to that is if you look at the sort of interaction bar there where there's 3 dots and it says more. If you mouse over that, you can click chat to open that chat window. If you have any questions, answer that. I believe Todd Sutherland is monitoring the chat this morning, and that's how you're also going to answer the questions or the quiz questions that we have today. So participate in all 5 webinars. So you come to all 5 webinars, you get a free copy of the heat pump service manual, and there will be also 4 giveaways today. The first correct answer for each of the 4 questions, and we're going to break that up. We'll have 2 reversing valve questions and 2 defrost questions. And the pictures that you see here are sort of representative of the prizes that you can win, valued at $50 or more. And again, you're going to answer those questions through the chat window. It looks like some folks are already chatting away. So thanks for coming. So again, we're going to talk about reversing valves. We'll go through the operation of the valve, some troubleshooting, what ways that you can troubleshoot that valve, and then we'll talk about demand defrost. Why is it necessary? Types of defrost, the operation and troubleshooting of the defrost board and sensors. So the reversing valve is a valve that changes the flow of the refrigerant through the system, right? So it's powered by a 24-volt solenoid that controls a pilot valve, and I'll go into that in a little bit more depth in another slide or two. So in cooling mode, it directs the hot gas or the compressor discharge line to the outdoor coil, right? So in cooling mode, our outdoor coil is our condenser. And in heating mode, we energize that solenoid and shift the valve, and that changes the flow of refrigerant as far as which coil is doing what job, right? So again, in cooling mode, the outdoor coil is our condenser. In heating mode, we're going to change that discharge line and pump that hot gas inside the conditioned space, and then the indoor coil becomes our condenser coil. And it is wired to be on your thermostat. So typically in a heat pump thermostat, you're going to have an O/B terminal. You're going to need to select that or change that from O to B, and B is going to energize in heat. So Ruud heat pumps energize the reversing valve in heat mode, not in cooling mode. And the reason that we do that is because if that valve fails, we want it to fail in cooling. You have an option, at least, to have backup heat or emergency heat. There is no backup or emergency cooling. So if that valve happens to fail, or the solenoid opens, or whatever reason, we want it to fail in cooling so that we can still cool the space. In heat mode, both of your service valves are high pressure, high temperature. So if you're hooking up your gauges in heat mode, you want to make sure you put your suction line on that third port, which is the true suction line, and that comes directly off the middle tube, which is the common suction. That's always suction going into the compressor. So if you're operating a heat pump in heat mode and you hook your gauges up to your service valves like you would normally do in cooling, you could do some damage, especially if you've got some analog gauges. You could do some damage to the mechanical linkage in your gauge if you hook your suction line up to the hot gas line. So this is a cutaway of the reversing valve itself. You can sort of see that little dome that goes between the common suction, and I've got some other drawings of it. That's referred to as the bathtub, and that slides back and forth, and it either creates sort of an elbow or a loop between the center, which is, like I said, the common suction line, and either the right or the left. And depending on what mode it's in, that's going to be diverting or changing the flow of the refrigerant to either go to the indoor coil, or from the indoor coil, or from the outdoor coil. And then the bottom picture here shows sort of just a different view of a reversing valve. So we've got a 24-volt solenoid that energizes the pilot valve, and we've got a circle. I got a circle around this pilot valve here, and you can see that there's 3 tubes coming out the top side of that pilot valve, and it's those pilot tubes that cause that reversing valve to shift one way or the other. It's pressure. It's not that the solenoid or the 24 volts going into that solenoid doesn't actually move the valve. It diverts the pressure, and as we build up high pressure either on the right hand side or the left hand side of that valve, that pressure imbalance is what slides the bathtub back and forth. All right, so here's a sort of an artist's representation of a cutaway of the valve. So this is de-energized, right? It's in cooling mode. And you can see on the upper right, we've got the suction gas coming from our indoor coil. And it's being diverted to the center tube, which is always our common suction going into the compressor. So then coming out of the compressor, we go to the bottom port. And then that diverts that gas to the left-hand side, and that sends our hot gas or our discharge gas from the compressor to the outdoor coil. And as you can see right here, I'm sort of circling with my mouse. This is the pilot valve. So we have got our compressor discharge line. This tube is feeding into the pilot valve, and then we're pushing that higher pressure, higher temperature gas to the left-hand side of our reversing valve. This high pressure, right? And then over here, we've got low pressure, and that's this pressure imbalance is what causes the valve to shift. So now we have energized the valve in this heating mode graphic. We're going to energize the valve, right? This solenoid creates an electromagnetic field that slides this valve, and now we're diverting our discharge line gas to the right-hand side of this valve. High pressure, low pressure, the valve's going to slide over, and now we are diverting suction gas from the outdoor coil into the compressor, out of the compressor into our discharge line, where we go and send that to the indoor coil. Excuse me. If you think that you're not the valve's not shifting, there's a couple of things that could be causing that. You could have no 24 volts going to your solenoid. You could have a solenoid that's open. So first you want to verify that there's 24 volts going to the defrost board, right? So if we're not getting 24 volts to the defrost board between your R and C, or your red and your common, it's not going to work. And you got to verify that there's 24 volts in heat mode between B and common. So if we got 24 volts to the reversing valve and we've got 24 volts to the solenoid, the valve should be shifting. The other thing that you can do is you can check resistance or ohm out the solenoid coil itself and make sure that there's not it doesn't have an open winding. If it ohms out okay, the other thing that you can do is you can energize this valve. So put 24 volts to the solenoid. You can unscrew a bolt from the end of it and slide the solenoid off of the valve itself, and then energize that valve and stick a screwdriver in it. And if you let go of that screwdriver and the magnetic field that's created from the solenoid holds the screwdriver in there, then it's creating the magnetic field. So you don't have a control voltage issue. You might have another issue, but the first thing to check is to make sure that you're getting 24 volts to your solenoid and that it's creating the magnetic field that it needs to create to shift the pilot valve. So it's possible that you could have a valve itself that the slide or the bathtub's not sliding all the way, or it's not seating fully. And the way that you test that is you would take a thermometer, a K-type thermocouple. Don't try to use a stick thermometer, or don't try to use an infrared thermometer, and check between your two suction lines, right? So your center, your common suction line, and then whichever mode you're in, the other suction line. You can see here, I'm checking my common suction line. I'm checking the suction line coming from my cooling coil. And if you have more than a 10-degree temperature rise across these tubes here, that's telling you that the bathtub is not fully seated and some of that hot discharge gas is mixing in. Now, a little bit of temperature rise here is going to happen no matter what, just because the bathtub's not really insulated well. But if you have a temperature rise of more than 10 degrees across your suction lines, your valve is defective and you need to replace it. So just sort of using these graphics here, if the bathtub's not fully seated, some of this discharge gas, right, and this hot gas is going to get mixed in with this suction gas, and that's what would cause your temperature rise here. Another sort of old school trick to figure out if your valve is sliding or not. So the valve body itself is typically made of brass, and the bathtub and the slide that the bathtub is built into is typically made of steel. So these two ends right here are made of steel. If you take a magnet, a rare earth magnet, you can get them at Harbor Freight or anywhere really. If you take one of these magnets and you put it down on the slide, and as you put it down on the valve body, and as you sort of slide it down the valve, it'll find this steel. It'll find this steel piece here, and it'll stick to it. So if you take this magnet and you put it on the end of your valve, and then you energize the valve, and you watch this magnet track and slide all the way over, like we've got right here, you can see that the valve itself is sliding. A lot of people condemn valve because they think the valves aren't sliding. You could have a pressure. You might not have a large pressure differential, and it could be a compressor that's causing you problems, and not necessarily a reversing valve that's not sliding. So if you can see the magnet track and it's essentially like watching the valve move back and forth, and you don't have more than a 10-degree temperature rise here, then your valve's working like it's supposed to. Any questions about reversing valves?
I don't see any.
Okay. All right, so we're going to move on to the first two questions. So go ahead and open up the chat window and get ready to type. So our first question is, in what mode is the reversing valve energized? So what mode do we revert, or do we energize the reversing valve? Wow,
Okay.
lots of answers.
We wait. This thing goes so fast.
I know. And hey, I saw a comment that I'm talking loud. I'm sorry, I'm a loud talker, so you might need to adjust.
No.
volume
Somebody
on
couldn't
your-
hear you. Somebody couldn't hear you. And we were just saying
Okay,
that
okay.
We can hear you just fine. It must be a computer issue on their end.
Not being able to
Okay,
hear
our
you
winner
usually not a
is
problem.
Abdias Gallardo. Abdias Gallardo, he typed in heat.
All right, fantastic. Next question is, if the reversing valve should be replaced if the temperature rise exceeds how many degrees Fahrenheit?
Zoom, there they go.
I know, so many answers.
We got a couple people that said cooling about energizing the valve. So come on, people, pay attention.
All right, so we do energize that valve in heat, and that is the opposite of the way that most equipment manufacturers energize their valves. A lot of people energize in cooling. We don't do that. We energize in heat.
Okay, the answer to the second question is 10, and the winner is Mark Kearney. Congratulations.
Big winners. All right, so we're going to move. There's no questions about valves. We're going to move on to demand defrost. So defrost is necessary because in heating mode, the outdoor coil temp can drop well below 32 degrees. The moisture that's in the air. So think about an evaporator coil, because essentially that's what your outdoor coil is, right? Your outdoor coil is your evaporator in heat. And as the temperature of the air pulling through that evaporator coil is below 32 degrees, the coil is going to freeze up. And that's exactly what happens, right? So as we're removing the heat, right? We're moving the heat from the air into the refrigerant. We're also condensing, right? So any moisture that's in that air is going to drop out. It's going to condense on the coil. That moisture is going to freeze. It's going to make it harder for us to pull air through the coil. And that frost, the ice, is also acts as an insulator. So we have to remove that ice that builds up on our outdoor coil. And the way that we do that is we switch the system back into cooling. Hot gas from the compressor moves back outside like it would in cooling, and that hot gas melts the frost on the outdoor coil. When we're doing that, so it's necessary for us to have to go into defrost, but anytime that we go into defrost, it's counterproductive. We've been working really hard to remove heat from outdoors and reject it inside. And now we switch into defrost, and we're taking that same heat that we've been working so hard to put in the house. Now we're removing it to melt the ice on the outdoor coil. So defrost cycles need to be kept to a minimum. We need to only go into defrost when we actually need to defrost the coil. And so the process of the way that works is we initiate a defrost cycle, reversing valve shifts to cooling mode, or we de-energize the valve. The outdoor fan motor shuts off. That's going to make our head pressure outside get higher. That's going to make more heat, and it's going to defrost the coil faster. And then I know in some parts of Florida, there is no supplemental or auxiliary heat. In some places, I guess further south, you guys don't put in any electric heat. I would always recommend putting in something, just because when the system goes into defrost, now it's cooling, and that supplemental heat will act to sort of offset the cooling effect, and the air won't be as cold blowing out the vents. So there's really two types of defrost. There's time temperature, which we're really not going to go into very much, but that is a very old school way of going into defrost. And then there's demand defrost, and all modern heat pumps really use demand defrost. So what demand defrost looks at is it looks at ambient temp. So what's the temperature outside? It looks at coil temp. What's the temperature of the cooling coil? And then there are certain algorithms and their proprietary sort of sliding scales or windows that we look at: outdoor temp, we look at coil temp, we look at historically how long has it taken to go into defrost, what can that delta be between coil temp and outdoor temp, and that's when we go into defrost. And again, those are going to be sliding scales based on runtime, based on temperatures. So there will be a few slides in here where I just talk about the delta T or the difference in temperature, because those temps aren't set necessarily. So the system only enters defrost when it is necessary, and that's the most effective way. It's the most efficient way to defrost, to only go into defrost when we need to. So there's three conditions that need to happen for one of our heat pumps to go into defrost. So the outdoor coil temp has to be, the outdoor coil temperature has to be below 35 degrees Fahrenheit. And we have to have minimum 34 minutes of compressor runtime with the outdoor coil temp below 35 degrees. So, and then we're going to look at a sliding scale, right? That's where that delta T or that algorithm comes into place. But outdoor temp, and I'm sorry, there's a typo here. This should say outdoor temperature, not outdoor coil temperature. So our outdoor ambient has to be below 35 degrees, and we have to have 34 minutes of runtime with the coil temp below 35 degrees. If we don't reach either one of those within 6 hours of runtime, we're going to force defrost. So if we've had 6 hours of accumulated runtime at a temperature below 35 degrees, so if we run for 5 hours and then we have a 40-degree day, we're going to start over, right? So we have to have 6 hours of runtime with the outdoor temp below with the outdoor coil temp below 35 degrees, and then it's going to go into a forced defrost. And then that defrost cycle is going to continue. So we'll stay into defrost until our coil temp has reached the termination temp, or we've run for 14 minutes. So either 14 minutes of defrost, which is a long time, or the coil temp has reached its termination temp. And that ships from the factory at 70 degrees. So our factory termination temp for defrost is 70 degrees. Now, you can change that temp to 50, 60, or 80. I don't necessarily recommend doing that. I would leave it at 70, and I'll talk a little bit about why in just a minute. So after a run cycle, the control resets the timers. It recalibrates that delta T or that temperature differential that it's looking for, and then it prepares for the next defrost cycle. So if you lower the defrost termination temp, it's going to, let's say you lowered it to 50 degrees. It's very possible that you might come out of defrost before you have melted all the ice on that coil. So it will cause it to have shorter defrost cycles, but you might come out of defrost before you've melted all the ice off of the coil. You can raise that temperature, but again, if you raise the defrost temp to say 80, the system's going to stay in defrost longer than it needs to, and that's going to cause you a hit in efficiency. It's going to be less efficient, and we're going to be blowing cold air in the house longer than we need to. So we use several different defrost boards. This is an example of one of the boards that you might find out there, and a defrost kit is going to come with a defrost board is going to come in a kit that comes with a board and a coil sensor and an ambient temp sensor. The defrost board is going to monitor, like I've mentioned, outdoor ambient temp, outdoor coil temp, compressor runtime, and it's also wired in to high and low pressure switches. Starting late 2019, we moved to a new defrost board that has the option to modify the board to a 0-second delay. And so what that means is, so when we go into defrost, the system has a 30-second sound abatement delay. So what that means is that when we energize defrost cycle, we shut the compressor off for 30 seconds. We start back up. We slide the valve. What we found that in some applications, that 30-second delay was causing the reversing valve to make a very strange noise. It sounds like a trumpet. People sometimes refer to it as a moose call. And so the new board allows you to clip a wire, and you can see I've got a circle around it that is a delay. So if you clip that wire, you take your side cutters and you clip that wire, that's going to get rid of that 30-second delay, and there will be a 0 delay. So that valve will shift or de-energize and shift back to cooling without de-energizing the compressor. It just does it on the fly. And if you're having an issue where during that 30-second delay, the reversing valve is making a loud noise, clip that wire and get rid of that delay, and that might take care of that for you.
Wade,
Yeah.
Wade, earlier somebody wanted you to briefly touch on the fact that because it's demand defrost and because certain conditions need to be met, that it's not uncommon for that unit not to go into defrost even though we're below 35-degree outdoor ambient.
Yes, absolutely. It might not, and so that's true for a lot of reasons, right? A lot of times, especially in warm, relatively warmer climates like you guys have in Florida, the outdoor coil itself might defrost in off cycle, meaning that it might be warm enough, or you might have enough sun exposure on the house, or whatever reason that it might never actually go into defrost. That doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with it, but and I'm going to talk about how to force a unit into defrost here in just a minute. But it's not just looking at outdoor temperature; it's also looking at outdoor coil temp and the difference between those. And if it doesn't have any issues defrosting on off cycle or otherwise, it might not go into defrost. Now, if it's run for 6 hours and it hasn't defrosted, it's going to go into defrost just to just to sort of make sure, right? It's setting a benchmark. It's going to go into defrost after 6 hours of runtime at 35 degrees or lower, just to make sure there's not a problem. So the boards, and depending on which defrost board you have, it might have one LED, it might have two LEDs. But if the defrost board has LEDs on it, there will be flash codes printed on that board. And I took some pictures of them here. You can see one of them, there's a fan relay, and the board that has that particular relay on it only has one LED. It's a little bit older board, but you can see that if you don't know to look there for those those flash codes, you're not going to see it probably. The one on the right, it's easier to read and it's easier to see, but if you're not really looking closely, especially if it's upside down or whatever, you might not see it. I'm going to go back to the newer board, and you can see that, I'm sorry, this photo is not very high resolution, but you can see there, just above above and right of the circle, there's your flash codes here. Here's your LEDs. So if you've got LEDs on the board, 99 times out of 100, it's going to be printed on that board. I don't like to speak in absolutes, because there may be some board out there that we used for a very short period of time that doesn't have the codes on it, but I haven't seen one. So your temp sensors. The defrost coil sensor is clipped to the second tube down on the top of the outdoor coil. You can see it in the picture here on the lower left. The ambient air sensor is located under the control panel. And there's a couple of things that that will and won't happen, right? So if either one of these sensors fails, you're gonna see different results, right? So if the ambient air sensor fails, we're on the lower right, the control will go into defrost with every 34 minutes of runtime at the coil temp below 35 degrees, because it's going to have that defrost, right, every 6 hours, right? If the coil sensor fails, the control will not go into defrost, because it's looking at that coil sensor or that coil temp to be at 35 degrees or less for any accumulated amount of runtime. And if it can't read that temp, if it's open, it'll give you a flashing code that it has a sensor failure, but it won't go into defrost. So if the coil sensor fails, the unit will never go into defrost. Pressure switches. So the defrost control has active protection for low and high pressure. There is a 3-strike rule. So if it has a call and either low or high pressure opens 3 times, it'll lock out. It'll lock out operation of the unit. The low pressure switch opens at 15. It closes again at 40, and it does not monitor, or it ignores that low pressure for the first 90 seconds of operation, whether it's a call for heating or cooling. It ignores low pressure during defrost. It ignores low pressure for the first 90 seconds of a heat call after defrost. And if the outdoor temp is at 5 degrees or below, and the low pressure switch opens 3 times, it's going to lock the unit out until the outdoor temp rises to 6 degrees or more. I don't see that being that big of a problem for anybody on this call today. And the high pressure switch opens at 610 and it closes at 420 psi. I don't expect you to remember. I don't expect you to remember any of this stuff. These specs are in the installation manual, and they're also in the service manual that you're going to get if you come to all 5 of these classes. If you are so the board has a 5-minute short cycle timer. There's a 5-minute delay built into the board. Shorting the test pins together, and honestly, I don't like using an alligator clip for them. I like using a screwdriver and just putting it between them and sort of turning it at an angle to short the pins together. But you just short the pins together for 1 second, and you'll bypass that 5-minute short cycle timer. The test pins can also be used to force the unit into defrost mode. So you got to have a call for heating, short the test pins together, and keep them shorted together until it goes into defrost, right? So until after the 30-second sound abatement delay has gone by. So you're going to short those test pins. It's going to speed everything up. So that 30 seconds is not going to last 30 seconds, because when you're forcing it into defrost by shorting the pins together, it sort of fast forwards that logic. So once it comes out of that sound abatement delay, you can release the test pins, or you can move your screwdriver or your alligator clips. And the system will look at coil temp. It'll look at excuse me, and then it'll come out of defrost.
Wait, we got a couple of questions on the pressures.
Yeah, okay. I'll go
Somebody
back.
questioning that 15 psi is too low on an R410A system. Can you discuss the low pressure settings on that a little bit?
Well, what's going to happen is, as we're switching and going into either from steady state or going from one mode to another, we're going to see some pressure imbalances, and it's possible that for a very brief moment we might drop down to 15 psi or below, and then it's going to start building back pressure up. What we don't want is, we don't want to have nuisance trips that cause problems when there aren't really any problems, right? You guys are probably not going to see that in the climates in Florida, but as you know, as heat pumps become more and more prolific and they become more efficient, that footprint for heat pumps moves further and further north, and the colder it is outside, the lower that pressure is going to get. I wouldn't expect that we're going to see anything even close to that anywhere in the southeast, but that's why it's that we don't want to see any nuisance low pressure trips when there's not really a problem. It's just because it's extremely cold outside. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so sensors. So let me go back here. As I show, as we look at the flash codes, you can see that you've got coil sensor failure flash codes and ambient temperature sensor failure flash codes. It's very possible that you could be getting a temperature sensor failure code because that Molex plug's not plugged into the board really good, right? So first thing that you want to do is you want to make sure unplug and plug back in your sensor. Then check resistance, right? So all of the thermistors that we use are 10,000 ohm at 77 degree thermistors. And I sent a sent a temperature resistance chart to Nicole yesterday. After this class, she'll send that out to you so you'll have it. It's also available on PTS. Every sensor, every temp sensor that we use uses that same logic. It's 10,000 ohm at 77 degree negative coefficient. So if you want to ohm out or you want to verify the resistance, take your sensor, and you can either drop it in a cup of ice water for about 5 minutes. It's going to be 32 degrees, and then check resistance. And at 32 degrees, you should be between 32 and 33,000 ohms. You don't have to disconnect it and drop it in water. If you want to just take your thermocouple, your temperature sensor, and attach it to that thermistor to see what the temperature of it is, then you can check. So here's the chart, and you can see where I've got it circled. I hope you can see the very bottom of that on your screen. At 32 degrees, the resistance of that thermistor should be roughly 32,650 ohms. So if you check it and it's 32 degrees and you have a different reading than that, and if it fails, it's going to be way off. It's not going to be, well, the chart says 32,650 and I'm reading 32,980. Yeah, it's probably still good. It's going to be way off.
Wade, we have a question on the heat pump operating efficiently. What's the lowest outside temperature for a heat pump could operate efficiently?
Well, it really
What they want to
depends.
know, I think what they're asking is, how low of an outdoor ambient are we still getting heat from the heat pump in order to heat a home?
So at 35 degrees, it's going to struggle. And I'm talking about a single stage conventional heat pump, right? So if you want to talk about inverter systems, we can go down to 0 degrees and still be efficiently pulling heat out. But on a RP14, about 35 degrees is where it starts to struggle. We start to hit that balance point. That doesn't mean that at lower than 35 degrees, it can't pull heat out of the air. It just, they start to struggle. So, if you're concerned about that, so I have a 20 SEER heat pump here at my house. In my previous house, I had a 17 SEER heat pump, and rarely does it ever stage the emergency heat or the auxiliary heat on, because it can. I live just north of Atlanta, so it's not super cold here, but we have some nights where it gets down into the low double digits, and it keeps up just fine. So I know it might not have been a very good answer, but traditional heat pump struggles at 35 degrees and below. They can still pull out heat, but it's hard for them to gain too much capacity. And if you think about why, as the outdoor temp drops, there's less heat available to pull out of the air to move inside. So the colder it gets outside, the harder it is to pull out that heat. Many factors impact a heat pump's frosting patterns and its ability to defrost completely. Incorrect indoor airflow is huge. Equipment mismatch, refrigerant charge issues, dirty outdoor coil, installation issues, voltage issues, et cetera, et cetera. Incorrect indoor airflow is a huge one, especially with heat pumps. And in 2 weeks, we'll be talking about airflow. And if you think about the difference in size in a heat pump, think about the difference in size between an indoor coil and an outdoor coil. And there are many, many heat pump systems out there that technicians are going out twice a year and they're adjusting the charge. They're adjusting the charge in the spring and they're adjusting the charge in the fall, because either the coils aren't matched properly, the indoor and outdoor coils aren't matched, or they don't have the right airflow. And to make it work, they're adjusting the refrigerant charge. It's called seasonal charging. really shouldn't be done. That's indicative of a problem. But it's very common. So some sort of common complaints. Occasionally, the system blows cold air. Okay, that could be either that there is no auxiliary heat, so there is no electric heat, or it's not wired properly, or for some reason it's just not engaging the backup heat when it goes into defrost. So once the system goes into defrost, we should be energizing the D terminal, or the purple wire at the defrost board, and that should be going indoor to the air handler to energize the backup heat during defrost. Noisy outdoor unit, and especially if your customer or the homeowner has never had a heat pump before. So there's always going to be associated sounds and noises when a system goes in and out of either defrost, or just we energize the reversing valve, to initiate a call for heat.
Wait, about how long does that trumpet sound last that you referred to earlier?
So it depends. Now, it's not the trumpet sound that I'm referring to is not, I wouldn't consider that to be normal operation, but I've heard it go on for 8, 10, 12 seconds. And it has been quite loud on the videos that I've seen. So if that's something that you're seeing, you can try that board and clip that delay. But there's always going to be some noises associated with shifting that valve. And we're never going to get rid of them altogether. And then another complaint that sometimes you'll hear, and this is typically with people who've never had a heat pump before, is when the system goes into defrost, they hear a noise, they look out the window, and they see what they think is smoke rising from the outdoor unit, right? It's really just the steam from melting the frost that's on the coil, but sometimes people mistake that for fire, and they think that the unit's on fire. So just a couple things that you would want to talk to your customer about, while you're talking to them about getting a heat pump.
That trumpet sound you're talking about, is that when it's going into defrost or coming out of defrost?
I've heard it on both, but typically it's during that delay, right? So we de-energize the compressor for 30 seconds, and then what's happening is, as the pressures are equalizing during that sort of 30-second sound abatement, the valve is just sort of starting to shift, and then we start back up and build a head of pressure on the other side. I've heard it on both. Now, if it's only happening, or if it's happening before defrost and after defrost, or if it's happening during an off cycle, there's not a whole lot we can do about it. Cutting that delay wire is only going to help you if it's happening during the 30-second sound abatement. I don't want to make too big of a deal of it because it hasn't been a huge problem, but for those systems that experienced it, it was a big problem to them. All right. Before we move on to the two final questions, are there any other questions about defrost? And we'll have a Q&A sort of opportunity here in a minute for anything else too.
No, I think we're good, Wade.
All right. So question number 3: how do you force a Ruud heat pump into defrost mode? What do you have to do to force it into defrost?
All right, hang on.
It looks like the chat count stops at 99.
Well, John Manning typed "jump out." So that's up to you, Wade. Are you going to accept jump out?
Well, I mean, technically he's right, but you can jump out a lot of things, right?
Yeah, so sorry, John. We're gonna have to give this one to Josh Clemens, even though Josh, I could tell he fat fingered his keyboard. He typed in test poons, knowing he meant test pins. Will you accept that, Wade? Let's see. The next answer from Billy is jump test pins.
I'm gonna say we're gonna have to go with jump test pins. So sorry, you guys that are trying to be quicker. That's the only fair way that I know how to do it.
All right, that goes to Billy Miller.
Please send all your complaints to Todd Sutherland. So the fourth and final question is, if the coil sensor fails, when will a Ruud heat pump go into defrost? Yikes.
Yeah, they knew the answer to that one.
That's a lot of quick answers.
Okay, so Billy, you can only win once, my friend. So sorry. Let's see. Trying to see who had the first answer. Mark Kearney. But Mark, you've already been a winner today, so sorry about that.
You guys got to give somebody else a chance.
William Andrews. Never.
All right, never. That is correct. All right, so we talked about, just sort of recap, we talked about reversing valves, operation of the valve, showed you a couple cutaways. There's a lot of sort of misconceptions and mystery around TXVs and reversing valves, really. But around reversing valves, a lot of people don't really get how it works, and it stymies them a little bit. So
yeah, so Wade, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Just looking at a couple of the answers that came through to that last question, just want to reiterate on that, because a couple of the answers like were after 6 hours. So the unit will force a defrost after 6 hours of runtime below 35 degrees. But if that coil sensor has failed, it will not.
Right.
Okay.
Because, okay, so yeah. So it's going to go into defrost after 6 hours of runtime if the coil sensor is at or below 35 degrees, not the ambient sensor. So it's looking at coil temp. So if the coil sensor fails, it can't monitor that temperature, and so it won't go into defrost. So I'm sorry if I wasn't clear about that earlier. Showed you a couple ways that you can troubleshoot the valve. We talked about demand defrost, why it's necessary, sort of some operation troubleshooting, and then you will be getting a temperature resistance chart for the thermistors that we ship with the unit. That temperature resistance chart is also in the service manual.
Yeah, and that's also pretty standard, right, Wade? That's a standard 10K ohm resistance chart that you can pretty much find in a million places on the internet.
Absolutely, just Google it. It's all over the place, and it's 10,000 ohm at 77 degree negative coefficient. Let me go back to the chart here. So you can see that negative coefficient means that as the temperature drops, the resistance increases, and as the temperature goes up, the resistance decreases. That's what the negative coefficient means. But we use this same 10,000 ohm at 77 degree negative coefficient thermistor on everything. It's what we use. So you don't have to worry if there's a thermistor on one of our units. This is the scheme. This is what it uses. This is the chart for it. Any other questions, comments, concerns? Doesn't look like it. Yeah, thanks for your time. I appreciate it. We will be back in 2 weeks with airflow and static pressure and airflow and capacity testing. So hope you can make it for that one. Thanks for your time. Thanks to everybody at Tropic for allowing me to do this.